Denver, Colorado. The table is set for 6, but I am the only one sitting here. My name is Judith Hamilton, and I am watching a candle burn down on a birthday cake no one else will ever see. They didn't just forget me, they calculated my absence. My father built his reputation on family values, but tonight across town, he is toasting my brother with the money meant to save us from eviction. They think they can edit me out of the picture and keep the frame. But they forgot that I am the one holding the pen, and I have receipts for every lie they ever sold. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The fourth chair remained empty for 45 minutes before the waiter stopped pretending not to notice. He hovered near my table, a pitcher of water in hand, his eyes darting between me and the place settings for 5 other people that I had meticulously arranged earlier that afternoon. I sat alone in the center of the banquette at the Lark, a trendy but modest spot in downtown Denver that I'd had to save up for 2 months to afford. I was wearing a velvet dress that I had bought specifically for tonight, deep emerald green, the kind of outfit intended to signal dignity. It was a dress that said I mattered, that I was an adult woman, worthy of an occasion, even if I had to pay for the occasion myself. "Is the rest of your party running late, ma'am?" the waiter asked. His voice dipped in that specific, crushing shade of pity reserved for women dining alone on their birthday. "They're on their way," I lied, keeping my voice steady. "My father is he's a busy man, community leader." I took a sip of water, staring at the empty seat at the head of the table. That was reserved for my father, David Hamilton. In our small town just an hour south, David was a legend. He was the former high school football star who had turned into the reliable local contractor, the man who fixed the church roof at cost, the guy who shook hands with a grip that promised safety. Growing up, our house was a shrine to his benevolence. He was the hero of every story he told. And sitting to his right should have been my mother Marlene, his eternal cheerleader, and my younger brother Ethan, the future of the family. My phone sat silent on the white tablecloth. I touched the screen, checking for a text, a call, anything. Nothing. The silence was loud enough to drag memories to the surface. I remembered being 16, standing in the kitchen holding a report card with straight A's, while my dad barely glanced up from the sports page because Ethan had successfully tied his cleats without help. I remembered the mantra that had been drilled into my bones since I could walk. Judith is the responsible one. Judith can handle it. Judith is too sensitive. If I complained about missed recitals or forgotten promises, I was dramatic. If I asked for the same allowance Ethan got, I was selfish. My role was fixed. I was the infrastructure of the Hamilton family. I was the one who quietly paid Ethan's traffic tickets so his insurance wouldn't spike. I was the one who co-signed on my parents' mortgage refinance 3 years ago when Dad's business took a hit, risking my own credit score because family supports family. I was the one wiring money for emergencies that always seemed to happen on weekends when Ethan wanted to go to Vegas. I checked the time. 55 minutes. The dread started as a cold knot in my stomach. It wasn't the fear that something terrible had happened to them. It was the sickening familiarity of being an afterthought. I looked at the appetizers I had ordered to stall for thyme calamari that had gone cold and rubbery. I knew this feeling. It was the texture of my entire childhood, but tonight was supposed to be different. It was my 29th birthday. I had explicitly asked for this one dinner. I had confirmed it 3 times. My phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a text from my mother's number. I snatched it up, desperate for an excuse, a flat tire, a sudden illness, anything that wasn't indifference. The message was short. It wasn't even from my mom. I could tell by the syntax. It was Dad. "We can't make it. Ethan needs us. You're not the priority right now. Enjoy dinner." I read it twice, then a third time. "You're not the priority." He didn't say, "Something came up." He didn't say, "Sorry." He used the word priority like a weapon. The sentence echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls of my skull until it drowned out the restaurant chatter. Not our priority. It wasn't a scheduling conflict. It was a statement of rank. It was a confirmation of the hierarchy I had spent my life trying to climb, only to realize the ladder was missing rungs. This wasn't forgetting. This was deliberate. This was a choice to show me exactly where I stood. "Ma'am?" I looked up. The waiter had returned holding a small, nicely wrapped box. He looked relieved, like he finally had good news. "A gentleman dropped this off at the host's stand earlier," he said, placing it on the table. "He said it was from your family, for your birthday." My heart gave a pathetic little leap. Maybe they had planned a surprise. Maybe the text was a joke. My hands trembled as I undid the ribbon. It was a watch box, a familiar watch box. I opened the lid. Inside sat a heavy silver chronograph watch. My breath hitched, but not from joy. I recognized this watch. I had bought this for my father 2 Christmases ago. I had spent a bonus check on it, agonizing over the inscription on the back. Slowly, I turned the watch over. The steel case back was scratched. Deep, jagged gouges marred the metal as if someone had taken a screwdriver to it in a hurry. Under the scratches, I could still faintly see the engraving I had paid extra for. "To Dad, thanks for believing in me, Judith." Stuck over the mutilated inscription was a cheap, crooked label from a label maker. It read, "Proud of you." It wasn't a gift for me. It was a re-gift intended for Ethan that they had grabbed by mistake, or perhaps out of pure laziness to shut me up. The card resting on top of the velvet cushion confirmed it. In my mother's hurried scrawl, "Happy birthday, Judith, from your family." They hadn't just skipped my dinner. They had recycled the physical proof of my love for them, defaced it, and handed it back to me as an afterthought. They didn't even check the back. Or maybe they did, and they didn't care. I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't a loud break. It was quiet, like a thread finally giving way under too much tension. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The time for being sensitive was over. I reached into my purse, pulled out a pen, and grabbed a paper cocktail napkin. I wrote 4 words, pressing hard enough to almost tear the paper. "Thank you. No more seats." I placed the napkin on top of the watch, left $300 in cash on the table to cover the untouched meal and the waiter's trouble, and stood up. I walked out of the restaurant without looking back at the empty chairs. The cold Denver air hit my face, drying the sweat on my hairline, but it couldn't cool the heat rising in my chest. I got into my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. As I started the engine, my phone lit up with a notification from Instagram. "Ethan H. has tagged you in a story." I shouldn't have looked. I knew I shouldn't have looked. But I tapped the notification. The video filled my screen. It was loud, chaotic, and bright. Ethan was laughing, holding up a glass of expensive scotch. The location tag was the Onyx Room, an upscale bar on the other side of town with a hefty cover charge. And there in the background were my parents. My mother was laughing, clapping her hands. My father had his arm around Ethan's shoulder, beaming with a pride he had never once directed at me. Ethan shouted over the music, "Drinks on the fam tonight," celebrating the big deal. A deal paid for with the $1,800 I had wired him last week. The money he swore he needed for rent, or he'd be evicted. I stared at the screen at the family that claimed I wasn't a priority while drinking my money. They didn't forget me. I realized putting the car in gear. They tried to erase me. The silence of my apartment usually felt like a sanctuary, a hard-won peace purchased with 60-hour work weeks and a lack of entanglements. Tonight, however, it felt like a vacuum. I didn't turn on the lights. I dropped my purse on the floor and sat on the edge of my couch, staring out at the Denver skyline. The city lights were indifferent, thousands of windows representing thousands of lives where people presumably weren't being surgically removed from their own families. My phone was still in my hand, heavy and warm. The image of the "Proud of You" sticker on the defaced watch burned behind my eyelids, but the notification from Ethan's Instagram story was the itch I couldn't stop scratching. I opened the app again. I needed to see the rest of it. I needed to understand the architecture of the lie. The video played loud and jagged in the dark room. The camera panned unsteadily around the booth at the Onyx Room. There was a bucket of ice with a bottle of Grey Goose. There were plates of oysters. And there was my father standing up holding a glass high. "To the dreamer!" Dad bellowed, his face flushed with liquor and triumph. "This family always sacrifices for the dreamer because we know he's going to take us to the moon." Ethan grinned, looking boyish and smug, feigning embarrassment. Then he held up a set of keys. Not car keys, motorcycle keys, a distinct heavy fob for a Ducati. "Thanks, Pop," Ethan said, hugging him. "Couldn't do it without the team." I froze the video. I stared at the keys. A motorcycle. My banking app was the next thing I opened. My thumb moved automatically, a reflex honed by years of managing crises that weren't mine. I scrolled back 1 week. There it was, a wire transfer for $1,800. The memo line read, "Rent, eviction help." I remembered the frantic phone call from Ethan last Tuesday. He had been crying, actually crying, saying his landlord was going to throw his fiancée and her daughter on the street if he didn't come up with back rent by Friday. He swore he had a job lined up. He swore on Grandma's grave. I had hesitated, then transferred the money from my savings, the account I labeled down payment. He wasn't threatened with eviction. I was ambushed by the truth. They were drinking my down payment. They were driving it. A cold, clinical clarity washed over me. It was strange. The heartbreak was there, throbbing like a bruised rib, but something else was taking over. A survival mechanism. I stood up, walked to my desk, and opened my laptop. The glow of the screen was harsh in the unlit room. I opened a blank spreadsheet. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my phone across the room. I typed. At the top of the sheet, I wrote the header, "Support nobody acknowledged." I started with the most recent line item. Date Oct 14. Amount $1,800. Recipient Ethan. Stated purpose rent, eviction. Actual purpose motorcycle party. Then I went back. I pulled up my bank statements from the last year, then the year before. The digital paper trail was long and bloody. August 12th. Amount $450. Recipient Mom. Purpose. Dad's blood pressure meds. July 4th. Amount $2,200. Recipient David Hamilton. Purpose payroll gap for construction crew. As I typed, memories overlaid the screen, vivid and stinging. I typed in the expense for the catering at Ethan's graduation party 3 years ago. I remembered standing in the corner of the VFW hall holding the receipt for $2,000 because Dad had left his wallet at home. Later that night, Dad had taken the microphone. "Look at this spread," he'd boomed. "We wanted to give our boy the best start. It takes grit to get a degree. That's Hamilton grit." He hadn't mentioned me. He hadn't even looked at me. I was just the wallet he had left at home, effectively. I typed another line, "Emergency braces for Ethan's stepdaughter." I loved that kid, I really did, but Ethan had called me in a panic saying he couldn't pay his child support. I paid the orthodontist directly. 2 weeks later, Ethan posted photos of a weekend trip to Cabo. Then came the memory that hurt the most. I added a line for St. Jude's roof repair fund. $5,000. The church roof had been leaking. The parish was desperate. Dad had stood up in Sunday service and pledged to get it done, basking in the applause. Later, he came to my apartment, head in his hands, admitting he was overextended and couldn't buy the materials. "It's my reputation, Judith. If I fail the church, I fail this family." I wrote the check. At the dedication ceremony, the pastor presented Dad with a plaque to David Hamilton, the rock of our church. I stood in the pews clapping while Dad wiped a fake tear from his eye. The anonymous donor was God's instrument, they said. I was the instrument. Dad was the melody everyone admired. I looked at the total at the bottom of the spreadsheet. It was staggering. It was a down payment on a house. It was a master's degree. It was a life. "They didn't forget me," I whispered to the empty room, the cursor blinking at the end of the long list of thefts. "They tried to erase me. They needed my resources, but they didn't want my presence. I was the silent partner in the business of making them look successful." I wasn't done. I opened a new folder on my desktop titled Evidence. I started screenshotting everything. The text from tonight, The Instagram story of the party, the captions on old photos where mom cropped me out or tagged me as camera shy. I went to Google and typed in a phrase that felt heavy on my tongue: family financial exploitation, adult child America. The results poured in: stories of financial abuse, of narcissistic parents, of the designated scapegoat. It wasn't just me, there was a name for this. Then a thought struck me, a sharp, terrifying spike of adrenaline. The house. My parents' house. The one I had co-signed on. Technically, I was a part owner. Dad had begged me to sign the papers 5 years ago because his credit was shot from a failed business venture. "You're the responsible one, Judith," he'd said. "Your credit can save this family." If they were willing to lie about rent and erase me from a birthday dinner, what else were they lying about? I navigated to the county clerk's online portal. My heart hammered against my ribs as I searched for the property address. The page loaded slowly, spinning a little wheel that mocked my anxiety. Property owner S. David Hamilton, Marlene Hamilton, Ethan Hamilton. I blinked. I leaned closer to the screen, cleaning my glasses, as if the smudge was on the lens and not the reality. I read it again. David Hamilton, Marlene Hamilton, Ethan Hamilton. My name wasn't there. I had signed the deed. I had signed the mortgage. I was legally liable for the debt, but according to this summary, I didn't own a square inch of the property. And Ethan, who had never paid a dime toward the mortgage, was listed as an owner. I clicked on the History tab to view the scanned documents. There, 3 months ago, was a quitclaim deed, a document transferring my interest in the property to Ethan. I scrolled to the bottom of the PDF. There was a signature on the line marked Grantor Judith Hamilton. It was neat. It was looped. It looked professional. But it wasn't mine. The PDF on my screen was high resolution, sharp enough to see the grain of the paper it had been scanned from. I zoomed in until the signature line occupied my entire field of vision. The letters were formed in black ink, tight, and looped with a practiced flourish that tried too hard to look authoritative. Judith E. Hamilton. I stared at the E. Elizabeth. It was my middle name, but it was a name I had buried since high school. I never signed documents with my middle initial. Not on my driver's license, not on my taxes, and certainly not on the original deed to the house 5 years ago. My hand always flowed directly from the H of Judith to the H of Hamilton. But this signature, this forgery, sat there with a polite, stiff E wedged in the middle. It was a clumsy mistake, the kind made by someone who knew my legal name but didn't know me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just forgotten me at a birthday dinner or borrowed money. They had rewritten the legal reality of my life. The house that I had saved, the house I had co-signed for when the bank laughed at my father's credit score, the house where I had paid the mortgage for 6 months while Dad restructured his business, was no longer mine. They had stolen my equity and gifted it to Ethan, the boy who couldn't even pay for his own celebratory drinks. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the sun drag itself up over the city, the light gray and unforgiving. At 8:00 a.m. sharp, I called the county clerk's office. Records Division. A woman answered, her voice sounding tired already. "I'm looking at a quitclaim deed recorded 3 months ago," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm listed as the grantor, but I never signed it." There was a pause, the clicking of a keyboard. "File number?" I gave it to her. "Okay, I see it here," she said. "Notarized on August 14th. Appear to be all in order, ma'am. Both parties present." "I wasn't present," I said, gripping the phone. "I was at work, in Denver. This document was notarized in Colorado Springs. How was my identity verified?" "Well, the notary stamp belongs to a Linda S. Miller. She attests that you appeared before her and produced valid ID. If you're saying you didn't, that's a very serious accusation. You're talking about fraud." "I know what I'm talking about," I snapped, then forced myself to breathe. "What do I do?" "You need a lawyer," she said, her tone shifting from bureaucratic to hushed. "A real estate or fraud attorney. Today." I hung up. The world felt tilted. My parents had either hired someone to impersonate me, or they had called in a favor from a crooked notary friend. Linda Miller. The name sounded familiar. She was the church secretary at my parents' parish. Of course. Before I could search for a lawyer, my phone buzzed. It was Camilla, my best friend since college, the only person who knew the full extent of the Hamilton family dynamics. "Hey, just FYI," the text read, followed by a grimacing face. "Your dad is already spinning this. He told the guys at church coffee hour that you've been unstable lately, making up stories about money, and that you threatened to sue your family because you're jealous of Ethan. Are you okay?" I felt the blood drain from my face. I hadn't even spoken to them yet. I hadn't confronted them about the deed. They knew I would find out. They knew the birthday snub would push me to look. This was a preemptive strike. I opened Facebook. I rarely used it, but I needed to see the battlefield. There it was. A post from Ethan's fiancée posted 2 hours ago. A picture of her, Ethan, and my parents, arms linked, smiling in front of the house, my house. So grateful for parents who understand that real love is about lifting each other up. Sad that some people will try to tear down their own flesh and blood for money. Not us. We're family. Blessed #Hamilton. Strong. The comments were a chorus of validation. "Ignore the noise, honey. You guys are the salt of the earth. Praying for the lost sheep in your flock. Money changes people, sad to see a daughter turn on her dad." They were painting me as the aggressor, the greedy, unstable spinster daughter coming for the family fortune. It was brilliant, really. By the time I opened my mouth to scream thief, the community would already believe I was just throwing a tantrum. For a moment I wavered. The conditioning ran deep. Honor thy father and mother. Family business stays in the family. Was I really going to drag them into court? Was I going to be the reason my dad's reputation, his most prized possession, was destroyed? I felt dirty, like I was betraying the very values they had raised me with: loyalty, resilience, sacrifice. Then I looked back at the spreadsheet on my laptop. Support nobody acknowledged. I looked at the forged E in my signature. They didn't value loyalty. They weaponized it to keep me quiet while they picked my pockets. I closed Facebook and searched for real estate fraud attorney Denver. I clicked on the website of a man named Harris. His bio didn't promise aggressive representation. It said protecting your assets from fraud and exploitation. I got an appointment for that afternoon. Attorney Harris was an older man with a messy desk and eyes that looked like they had seen every variation of human greed. He listened without interrupting as I laid it out. I didn't cry. I presented the spreadsheet, the bank statements, the original deed, and the forged copy. He looked at the papers for a long time. Then he took off his glasses. "Judith," he said, "this isn't just a family dispute. This is felony forgery. This is grand larceny. You have grounds for a civil suit to quiet title and restore your ownership, but this could easily become a criminal investigation." He tapped the spreadsheet. "This ledger. This establishes a pattern. They've been treating you as a financial resource, not a family member, for years. The forgery is just the escalation." "I want it back," I said. "I want my name on the house, or I want my equity paid out, and I want them to stop lying about me." Harris leaned forward. "I can draft the complaint. We can file a lis pendens on the house immediately, which will freeze any ability they have to sell or refinance it. It's a nuclear option. It tells the world the property is in dispute." He paused, looking me dead in the eye. "But you need to know something. When you file this, there is no going back. They will not apologize. They will escalate. They will use every secret, every insecurity, and every mutual friend to break you. Are you prepared for your parents to become your enemies?" I thought about the empty chair at the restaurant. I thought about the "proud of you" sticker pasted over my love. I thought about the text, "You're not the priority." They already erased me. I told him, my voice flat and hard. "I'm just putting the outline back in ink." "All right," Harris said, pulling a legal pad toward him. "Let's get to work." 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening that felt heavy with impending rain, I was waiting for a delivery of Thai food. I had spent the last 48 hours in a fugue state of document organization, scanning every receipt and bank statement into the encrypted cloud drive Harris had set up. I was exhausted, craving the mindless comfort of pad thai and silence. When the heavy knock rattled my front door, I checked the peephole, wallet in hand, expecting a delivery driver. It wasn't the food. Standing in the hallway, backlit by the flickering fluorescent bulb of the corridor, were my parents and Ethan. They weren't smiling. My father wore his church council blazer, the one he wore when he had to deliver bad news or ask for money. My mother was clutching her purse to her chest like a shield, her eyes already wet. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, looking bored and smug. I didn't open the door immediately. I stared at them through the fisheye lens, watching the distorted shapes of the people who had raised me. They looked like strangers. "Judith, open up!" My father's voice boomed, muffled by the wood. "We know you're in there." I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door, but I didn't step back to let them in. I stood in the threshold, blocking the way. "I didn't invite you." "We need to talk like a family," Dad said, pushing past me before I could protest. The others followed in his wake, invading the sanctuary of my small, quiet living room. The space instantly felt smaller, sucked dry of air. "You're hurting your mother," Dad said, turning to face me as if I were a recalcitrant teenager who had stayed out past curfew. "We heard what you're doing, going around to lawyers, telling lies to the county clerk. Judith, look at her." He gestured to Mom, who let out a practiced, trembling sob. "We heard you're telling people we stole from you," she whispered, her voice wavering perfectly. "After everything we've done, after we raised you, how could you do this to your parents?" Ethan snorted, wandering over to my bookshelf and picking up a framed photo, inspecting it with mock interest. "It's pathetic, really. You didn't even live in that house anymore, Jude. Why do you care whose name is on the paper? It's just a house." I watched them, expecting the old panic to rise, the desperate need to explain, to apologize, to smooth things over so we could go back to the pretense of harmony. But the panic didn't come. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp precision. "Sit down," I said. It wasn't a request. Surprised by my tone, they hesitated. Dad frowned, but took a seat on the armchair. Mom perched on the sofa. Ethan remained standing, smirking. I walked to my desk and picked up a manila folder. I didn't offer them water. I didn't ask how they were. I walked to the coffee table and laid out 2 documents side by side. The first was the printed spreadsheet, support nobody acknowledged. The second was the forged quitclaim deed with the Judith E. Hamilton signature highlighted in yellow. I'd spent my entire life making myself small so you wouldn't feel guilty about taking from me. I said, my voice steady. Tonight I let the truth take up space. Dad glanced at the papers, his face darkening. He waved a hand dismissively at the evidence. "This is nonsense. Scorekeeping. That's what this is. You're keeping score against your own blood." "It's not scorekeeping when you're the only one paying," I said. "And it's not family business when you commit a felony." Dad's mask of concern dropped instantly. The benevolent patriarch vanished, replaced by the bully who used to scream at referees during Ethan's pee-wee football games. He leaned forward, his face twisting with contempt. "We did what we had to do," he spat. "You want the truth? Fine. You're almost 30, you're single, no prospects. Oh, no kids. Ethan has a fiancé. He has a child. He has a real family." The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Real family. "We sacrificed everything for him," Dad continued, his voice rising. "The house is his legacy. We needed to secure it for him. You can take care of yourself. You're the independent one right now. You can sacrifice for him too, without making it a federal crime. It's what you owe us." "I owe you?" I asked, feeling the absurdity of it wash over me. "I paid the mortgage you couldn't afford. I paid for the roof over your head. And you'll keep paying if you know what's good for you," he threatened. "You think you can sue us, you're un-American. Thinking about lawyers instead of standing by your blood. If you pursue this, Judith, I will cut you out of my will for good this time. No one in the family, not your aunts, not your cousins, will ever speak to you again. You will be alone." Ethan laughed a cruel short sound. "She's already alone, Dad. That's why she's doing this. She's bitter." I looked at Ethan, then at my mother, who was drying her eyes and nodding in agreement with Dad's cruelty. They were a unit, a closed circle, and I was the fuel they burned to keep warm. I reached into the folder again and pulled out a single sheet of stiff cream-colored paper. It was the formal letter from Attorney Harris notifying them of the pending civil action and the investigation into the notary fraud. "You already tried to erase me on paper," I said, sliding the letter across the table toward my father. "This is me writing myself back in." Dad read the letterhead. His face went pale, then red. "As of today," I continued, "I am ending every financial tie. The automated transfer for the mortgage is canceled. The access to my emergency fund is revoked. No more bailouts. No more loans for rent. If the roof leaks, don't call me. If Ethan gets evicted, don't call me." Mom gasped. "You can't do that. The mortgage is due on the 1st. "Then I guess the real family better figure out how to pay it," I said. I looked at my father, meeting his gaze for the first time as an equal, not a subordinate. "You didn't lose a daughter tonight. You traded me for a narrative where you're always the heroes, and I'm done paying for the ticket to that show." Dad stood up so abruptly he knocked the coffee table, sending the papers sliding. "You ungrateful little—" "Get out," I said. I walked to the door and held it open. Ethan walked past me, muttering, "You're going to regret this when nobody wants you." Mom followed, sobbing loudly, now a performance for the hallway. Dad stopped at the threshold. He turned to me, his eyes cold, devoid of any warmth I had spent decades searching for. "You think the community will believe you over me?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "I built this town. I have friends in that courthouse. I have friends in the police. You're nobody. I'll erase you outside the family too." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw him not as a giant, but as a small, desperate man who had built a kingdom on a foundation of theft. "Good," I whispered, gripping the door handle. "Then you won't see me coming." I slammed the door. I locked the deadbolt. And for the first time in my life, the sound of the lock clicking into place didn't feel like I was shutting myself in. It felt like I was shutting the toxicity out. The Hamilton Family Community Builders Gala was held in the fellowship hall of the church where I had been baptized, confirmed, and systematically ignored for 29 years. The room was decorated with gold and white streamers, and a large banner hung behind the podium, the Hamilton Scholarship, investing in the future. I parked my car 2 blocks away. I wasn't on the guest list, obviously, but in a small town, no one asks for a ticket at the church door. I wore the same emerald green dress I had worn to my empty birthday dinner. It was my armor. Under my arm, I carried a slim navy blue presentation folder. Inside were 20 high-resolution copies of The Truth. Attorney Harris had advised against this. "Keep it in the courtroom, Judith," he had warned. "Don't give them ammunition to call you crazy." But the court of law was slow, and the court of public opinion was currently being presided over by my father, who was systematically destroying my character before the judge could even bang a gavel. I needed to testify in the only venue that mattered to him, his audience. I slipped into the back of the hall just as the lights dimmed. The room was packed with neighbors, former teachers, and the local business owners my dad played poker with. At the front, bathed in the spotlight, stood my father. He looked regal in his tuxedo, the very image of benevolence. Ethan sat in the front row looking bored but dutiful while Mom dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "In this family," Dad began, his voice booming with that charismatic vibrato that had sold 1,000 contracting jobs, "we don't abandon each other. We believe in sacrifice. We believe that when one of us rises, we all rise." A ripple of applause moved through the room. I felt bile rise in my throat. "This scholarship," he continued, gesturing to the giant novelty check covered in a velvet cloth, is the fruit of that sacrifice. It wasn't easy, times have been tight, but we dug deep because we believe in the dreamers. Just like we believed in my son Ethan. He beamed at Ethan. Ethan gave a thumbs up. And tonight, Dad said, I am proud to say that the initial $10,000 endowment comes entirely from the Hamilton family savings. That was the trigger. That $10,000 wasn't family savings. It was the inheritance from my grandmother that was supposed to be split between Ethan and me. Dad had bullied me into signing my half over to the general fund last year, claiming it was for Mom's medical bills. I didn't run down the aisle. I didn't scream. I walked. My heels clicked rhythmically on the linoleum, a metronome cutting through the hushed reverence of the room. Dad, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the acoustic perfection of the hall it carried. He froze. The spotlight caught me as I emerged from the shadows of the back rows. A murmur went through the crowd. Is that Judith? I heard she was having a breakdown. Judith, Dad said, his smile tightening into a rictus of warning. We're in the middle of the presentation. We can talk later. We're done talking later, I said, reaching the steps of the stage. I didn't climb up. I stood at the bottom looking up at him, forcing him to look down at the daughter he had stepped on to get there. If you're going to talk about sacrifice, let's be specific. I opened the Navy folder. I pulled out the spreadsheet enlarged and mounted on stiff cardstock. You said the money came from family savings, I said, my voice clear and steady, projecting to the back of the room. But here is the wire transfer from my personal account for $5,000 dated last June. The money you told me was for Mom's surgery, the surgery she never had. Security! Dad shouted, looking frantically for the elderly usher. Get her out of here. She's off her medication. I'm not on medication, David, I said, using his first name. It stopped him cold. And I'm not leaving until the ledger is balanced. I turned to the crowd. I saw faces I knew: Mrs. Gable, my third-grade teacher, Mr. Henderson, the grocer. They looked terrified, but they were listening. My father told you I was unstable, I told them. He told you I was greedy, but the truth is in the math. I held up the second document, the side-by-side comparison of the deed signatures. This is the deed to the house I co-signed for to save his credit, I said, and this is the forgery he filed 3 months ago to steal my equity and give it to Ethan. Ethan stood up, knocking his chair over. Shut up, Judith. You're embarrassing yourself. I ignored him. I pulled out the photo of the birthday watch, the scratched engraving. You talk about family unity, I said, looking back at my father. On my 29th birthday, you left me alone in a restaurant to pay for a table of 6. You sent me a text saying I wasn't a priority, and then you took the money I sent for Ethan's eviction notice and used it to throw a party at the Onyx Room. I held up the screen-printed photos of Ethan popping bottles of Grey Goose, the timestamp matching the wire transfer. This is what it looks like when one child is sacrificed so the golden sun can shine. I read from the top of my ledger. I have supported this family for a decade. I have paid the mortgage. I have paid the bail. And in return, you tried to erase me. The room was deadly silent. The air conditioning hummed, sounding like a roar. I'm not asking you to choose sides, I said to the crowd, lowering the papers. I just wanted you to know who is really funding this generosity. If you hear I'm the one tearing this family apart, know that I am only separating myself from the hands that tried to erase me. I placed the folder on the edge of the stage right next to the novelty check. It's all in there, I said. The police report number for the forgery is on top. My father looked like he was having a stroke. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The charm was gone. The hero mask had slipped, revealing the thief underneath. Pastor Miller stepped forward then. He didn't move toward me to remove me. He walked to the podium and gently placed a hand on the microphone, cutting off my father's potential rebuttal. I think, the pastor said, his voice grave, that we need to take a moment. The church takes allegations of fraud very seriously. We will look into this. He looked at me, and there was no judgment in his eyes, only a profound, sorrowful apology. I turned and walked away. The aisle felt miles long. I could feel eyes burning into my back, some in horror, some in realization. I didn't rush. I walked with the cadence of someone who had nothing left to hide. I pushed through the double doors into the cool night air. My hands were shaking now, the adrenaline crash hitting me all at once. My phone buzzed in my clutch. It was a text from Harris County fraud investigator just called. They're opening the case based on the notary evidence. We have them. Judith! The shout came from behind me. I turned near my car to see my father storming across the asphalt. He wasn't the regal figure from the stage anymore. He was a disheveled, red-faced man. "You happy now?" he screamed, stopping 10 feet away. "You humiliated us. You just destroyed this family." I opened my car door. I looked at him one last time, seeing the smallness of him, the desperate entitlement. "No," I said, my voice quiet but final. "I just stopped letting you destroy me." I got in, locked the door, and drove away, leaving him shouting at taillights that were already fading into the dark. The aftermath of the gala wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, grinding dismantle of the machine my father had built. The Monday morning after I walked off that stage, the machinery of the law began to turn indifferent to my father's charm or his standing in the community. Attorney Harris called me before noon. The county investigator had paid a visit to Linda Miller, the notary and church secretary. Faced with the prospect of losing her license and potential jail time for fraud, Linda hadn't hesitated to protect herself. She admitted that I hadn't been present when the deed was signed. She admitted my father had told her it was a surprise regarding estate planning and that he would handle Judith. The deed was legally void. The investigation into criminal forgery was now formally open. Harris described the scene in the conference room when my father and his hasty retained lawyer realized the gravity of the situation. "Your father is used to shaking hands to make problems go away," Harris told me, his voice dry. "He's finding out that you can't shake hands with a felony charge. And your brother." He asked if this meant he had to move out. "He didn't ask about you. He asked about the house." Hearing that Ethan was panicking about his living situation gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. It was the first time in his life that the consequences of his lifestyle were actually landing on his doorstep, rather than being diverted to my bank account. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and performed a ritual of severance. I logged into every service, every subscription, and every utility account that had my name attached to it, but their usage. I canceled the family streaming plan. I removed my card from the shared rideshare account. I called the power company for my parents' house where the bill was in my name because Judith is so organized, and scheduled a service disconnect for the end of the billing cycle unless the account holder was updated. Then I called my bank. "I want to place a permanent block on any transfers to these 3 account numbers," I told the representative. "And I want a flag on my account. No wire transfers without a voice verification and a secondary password." "Is everything okay, ma'am?" the banker asked. "Yes," I said, feeling lighter with every security protocol I engaged. "I'm just closing some old leaks." My phone had been vibrating incessantly since the gala. Calls from my mother, texts from Ethan ranging from begging to abusive, and voicemails from flying monkeys, aunts, and cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, telling me I was cruel. I didn't listen to a single one. I set up a call forwarding rule. All calls from family numbers went directly to a voicemail box that I never checked, but which automatically forwarded the audio files to Harris's paralegal. They were creating their own evidence file, and they didn't even know it. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. The town, however, was buzzing. When I went to the grocery store on Wednesday, I felt the eyes. In a small town, you can feel the temperature of a room shift when you walk in. Some people turned their carts down other aisles to avoid me. My father's narrative was strong. He had spent decades building social capital, but cracks were forming. I found a card in my mailbox on Thursday. It had no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on floral stationery. "Dear Judith, I was at the gala. I saw the papers. You did the right thing. Don't let them threaten you back into silence. We aren't all blind. It wasn't signed, but I recognized the handwriting of Mrs. Gable, the head of the church choir. A knot of tension in my chest loosened. I wasn't entirely a pariah. I was just the first person to say the quiet part out loud. I began to build a new kind of life, one populated by people who didn't require a deposit slip to love me. I spent my evenings with Camilla, who came over not to gossip, but to just sit on my couch and eat pizza while we watched bad reality TV. She didn't ask for anything. She just offered presence. I also joined a local writing group. It was terrifying to walk into a room of strangers and read a fictionalized version of my story, but when I finished reading a piece about a girl whose shadow was stolen by her father, the room was silent. A woman in the back simply said, "My mother did that to me." It was the first time I realized that my pain wasn't a personal failing. It was a shared scar. My neighbor, Ms. Ruth, became an unexpected anchor. She was 70, a retired librarian who smelled like chamomile and old paper. She saw me sitting on my porch steps one evening, staring at my phone, and invited me over for tea. I told her a sanitized version of what was happening. She didn't offer advice. She didn't tell me to forgive and forget like the church folks. She just poured more tea and said, "You can't keep a flower in a room with no windows and expect it to bloom, dear. You had to break the glass." Ms. Ruth became my model for what an elder should be, a source of wisdom, not a drain on resources. My father, unable to reach me and losing control of the narrative, went nuclear. A week after the gala, a notification popped up from a mutual friend. Dad had posted a long, rambling rant on Facebook. "It is a sad day in America when children sue their own parents. We gave her everything. We sacrificed our golden years for her education, and this is the thanks we get: greed. Pure greed. She is cold, un-American, and has lost her way. The devil works through envy." He didn't mention the forgery. He didn't mention the stolen equity. He just played the victim card loud and hard. I stared at the screen. The old Judith would have written a paragraph-long defense in the comments. I would have tried to explain, to plead for understanding. The new Judith took a screenshot. I opened my email, attached the image, and sent it to Harris with the subject line, "Exhibit G, defamation and violation of no contact request." I didn't engage. I realized that my silence was more powerful than his noise. My silence was a mirror he couldn't stand to look into. The next afternoon, Harris called. His tone was different, businesslike, but with a hint of victory. "Judith, they want to settle," he said. "Your father's attorney knows they can't win the fraud case. The notary has given us everything. They are offering a complete buyout of your equity share, reimbursement for your legal fees, and a repayment of the loans you documented in the ledger." I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I was 16. "Okay. There's a catch," Harris continued. "They want a non-disclosure agreement, a strict one. If you take the money, you can never speak about this publicly again. You have to take down any posts, retract your statements at the gala, effectively say it was a misunderstanding, and never discuss the forgery. They want to buy your silence to save his reputation." I gripped the phone. The money would set me up for life. It was everything I was owed. But the price was the truth. "I need an answer by tomorrow morning," Harris said. "Think about what you really want, Judith." I hung up and looked around my quiet apartment. The check would clear the debt, but signing that paper would mean agreeing that I was the one who misunderstood. It would mean letting him keep the hero mask. I had to decide if revenge was about punishment or if it was about freedom. The morning I had to give Harris my answer, I spent 2 hours staring at the settlement agreement. The sum on the final page was substantial. It was the return of my down payment, the reimbursement of the rent loans, my share of the grandmother's inheritance, and a buyout of my equity in the house. It was enough to wipe my slate clean and start over. But the clause on page 4 stared back at me like a loaded gun. The plaintiff agrees to retract all public statements regarding the defendants and acknowledges that the filing of the deed was a clerical error. They wanted me to sell them back their reputation. They wanted me to sign a lie so they could walk into church next Sunday with their heads held high, pointing to my signature as proof that I was just confused, just a little unstable, just a difficult daughter who finally came to her senses. I picked up the phone and called Harris. "I'll take the financial settlement," I said, my voice clear. "But delete page 4. I won't sign the NDA. I won't retract a single word." "Judith," Harris warned. "They might pull the offer. They're terrified of the criminal investigation. They need this to go away quietly." "No," I corrected him. "They need the civil suit to end so they can beg for leniency on the criminal charges. If they don't settle with me now, I drag this out in open court. I put the notary on the stand. I put Ethan's bank records on the screen. Tell them they can keep their money or they can give me what is mine and keep their mouths shut. But I am not selling my voice." An hour later, Harris called back. They had folded. They were terrified. The deal was done. I got the money. I kept my truth. That evening, my phone buzzed with a notification from a number I had blocked but which had managed to slip through to my voicemail. It was my father. I sat on my floor surrounded by packing boxes. I was moving to a new apartment, one they didn't have a key to, and played the message. "You won okay?" His voice was thick, likely from scotch. "Are you happy now you broke this family? Your mother can't show her face at Bible study. Ethan is having panic attacks. You destroyed everything because you couldn't just let it be. I hope the money keeps you warm, Judith, because you've got nothing else." The old Judith would have crumbled. She would have heard the pain in his voice and rushed to fix it. But I just listened to the silence that followed the click. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel guilt. I felt a profound, quiet detachment. I didn't delete the voicemail. I saved it to a folder labeled Reminders. It wasn't a trophy. It was evidence not for a court, but for me. A reminder that until the very end he refused to take responsibility. He blamed me for the wreckage he caused when he drove the car into the wall. I didn't call back. I didn't send a final text. I realized that the ultimate revenge wasn't screaming at him. It was refusing to perform pain for him anymore. He wanted a fight, because a fight meant he still mattered. My silence was the only thing that could truly reach him. That night, I opened my laptop one last time. I closed the support nobody acknowledged spreadsheet. I moved it to the archive. Then I opened a blank document and typed a new title, "What I Owe Myself." I typed slowly, letting each bullet point settle in my chest like a foundation stone. I owe myself the safety of a home that isn't a bargaining chip. I owe myself the right to say no, without apologizing for it. I will never again sacrifice my mental health to be the good daughter. I will build a life where my love isn't a down payment on someone else's approval. I printed the list. I took a yellow sticky note and wrote a single sentence on it, taping it to the refrigerator of my new apartment. You're allowed to leave the table when love is no longer being served. 2 weeks later, I boarded a plane. It was a solo trip to the Pacific Northwest, a place of gray skies and deep green forests. It was the first vacation of my life that wasn't dictated by family obligations or cut short by a crisis call. For 7 days I hiked. I turned my phone off. I stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean and screamed into the wind, letting go of 30 years of held breath. No one called to ask for rent. No one texted to say I was selfish. The world didn't end because I wasn't there to hold it up. I returned to Denver with a new purpose. I started writing again, but not just for me. I turned my experience into a series of essays and eventually a script for a podcast about financial abuse and emotional erasure in families. I changed the names, but I kept the feelings raw. When the first episode dropped, my inbox flooded. "This happened to me," they wrote. "I thought I was the only one. My parents did this too." I wasn't the isolated crazy daughter anymore. I was a witness. 6 months later, my birthday arrived. There was no dread this time. No checking the phone. No reservation for 6 with 5 empty chairs. I walked into a small, warm Italian bistro. Camilla was already there waving a glass of red wine. Sitting next to her was Ms. Ruth wearing her best Sunday hat and smiling. "Happy birthday, darling," Ms. Ruth said, sliding a small hand-knit scarf across the table. "No price tags, just time." Camilla handed me a card. Inside was a donation receipt to a legal aid fund for victims of domestic fraud made in my name. "I thought you'd like this better than a watch," she grinned. We ate pasta. We laughed until our sides hurt. We talked about books and work and the future. No one mentioned my father. No one mentioned Ethan. The absence of their drama wasn't a void. It was space for joy, space for peace, space for me. I looked around the table. Every seat was filled. The people sitting there wanted to be there. I took a sip of wine and looked at the candle on my small slice of cake. I made a wish, but it wasn't a wish for things to be different. It was a wish of gratitude, that they were exactly as they were. My dad thought he could erase me from the family. He thought that by taking my name off the deed, by scrubbing me from the photos, he could make me disappear. All he did was free me to build a life where I finally belong. If you're listening to this, if you've ever been ambushed by the people who were supposed to protect you, if your own parents used the word family as a weapon to threaten you into staying small, hear me now. Walking away doesn't make you cold. It doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you honest. They can scratch your name off the deeds. They can crop you out of the photos. They can tell the neighbors you're crazy. But they don't get to erase you. Not if you're the one holding the pen. With the candle blown out and the laughter of true friends filling the air, Judith finally closed the ledger on her past. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and reclaiming one's voice, please consider subscribing and liking the video. What would you have done in Judith's position? Let us know below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.